I think are very familiar with his work, and I see we've got now 51 participants in the meeting, so that shows that this is a very popular event. So just a very brief biography. Nico received his PhD from Maastricht University and did postdocs at the University of Minnesota and NIH, and then was for a number of years a program leader at the UK Medical Research Council Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit at the University of Cambridge. He then has moved to Columbia University, where he's professor of psychology and neuroscience and principal investigator and director of cognitive imaging at the Zuckerman Mind Brain Behavior Institute, and co-founder of the Cognitive Computational Neuroscience Conference. So Nico is very well known for a range of work as an international expert in human vision neuroscience and computational neuroscience, in particular in object recognition in the human brain, and is the developer of a very popular, influential analysis technique called representational dissimilarity analysis, but has made just as profound contributions in terms of deep artificial neural network models of visual processing and human cortex. And I think that's what we're going to hear about a bit today. And so I'm going to turn it over to Nico. I'm very excited to hear your talk, Nico.
Thank you so much, James. Really happy to be with you in New York. So let me share my screen. All right. So I want to talk about testing deep neural network models of human vision with brain and behavioral data. So the two keywords here are testing. So we want to not just build models of how the brain performs the task of visual recognition and other visual tasks, but we also want to compare those models to data acquired in humans, and in particular to brain activity data and behavioral responses. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about neural networks. So this is a very exciting modeling paradigm that many of us are using now, but not everyone is familiar with it. So let's just talk about some of the basics first. So a neuron in a neural network model is a highly abstracted unit that takes a pattern of inputs and computes a linear combination of those inputs followed by a static nonlinearity. There's a range of different nonlinearities that these highly abstracted units can use. A very popular one is the one shown in red here, the rectified linear nonlinearity, where the output is just the linear combination when it's positive, or when the linear combination is negative, the output is 0. These simple units can be hooked up in different network configurations. So here's a shallow feed-forward configuration of units. So this is a network with a single hidden layer. That's why it's called shallow. So there's just a transformation from the input to the hidden layer, and then another transformation to the output. And here's an example of a deep neural network. It's called deep when it's got more than one hidden layer. Here it's got 2 hidden layers. But there's also networks that are very deep with tens or hundreds of layers. So the word deep is also used in a graded sense to describe this important aspect of the architecture of feed-forward neural networks. And finally, these units can be hooked up in configurations where the signal flow is recurrent. And these kinds of networks naturally produce dynamics and lend themselves to analyzing dynamics and producing dynamic patterns such as needed for motor control. this non-linearity inside the unit is needed to make a hidden layer useful. Let's imagine a simple neural network with just linear activation functions. So we've got these two input units here. Each of them corresponds to a dimension of a two-dimensional input space. Now let's imagine these hidden layer units were all linear units. So each of them would compute this ramp function over the two-dimensional input space. If this were the case, then at the stage of the output units, we'd just be linearly recombining these linear combinations. And so we'd never get beyond a linear combination of the input. So at the output stage, also, we could only ever model linear functions of the input. So this is a great limitation of linear neural networks. However, when we use nonlinear activation functions, such as these sigmoid functions here, then we have a much more expressive language for approximating all kinds of functions between input and output. So when we combine these three nonlinear ramp functions here, one level up, we get this complicated function. And if we pass this through another sigmoid activation function, in this particular case, we get this response in the single little region of the two-dimensional input space. So when you think about this, it's easy to see how by adding enough hidden units here, you can map any region of the input space to any desired output in a given output unit. And you can do that for each of the output units. And this is why this framework of feed-forward neural networks with nonlinear activation functions provides a class of universal function approximators, which means that they can approximate any continuous function linking the input to the output with arbitrary precision, given just enough hidden units here in the hidden layer. And this is even true for shallow neural networks. So these shallow neural networks already provide universal function approximation. So this raises the question of why we might ever need deep neural networks. And the short answer is that deep nets can reuse features that they've computed in one layer downstream, and therefore they can represent many complex functions much more concisely with fewer units and weights. Another important question is why we might need recurrent neural networks. And a very brief answer to that is that recurrent networks can recycle their weights and units over time, so they can replicate their limited physical resources a long time to perform more complex computations. And they provide universal approximators of dynamical systems. So they really provide a very general class for modeling dynamical systems in general. So this all reinforces the point that neural networks provide this very flexible way of modeling dynamical systems and functions. And it immediately, of course, raises the concern that these models are so flexible that they don't really provide a falsifiable hypothesis of how a system like a biological brain might work, but instead they provide more of a language in which we can express particular computational theories. So the framework itself is not falsifiable, it's not a theory, but it's a language, and it's a powerful language for expressing the computational theories we might want to test. In my own field of vision, there's a particular kind of feed-forward neural network that has been very successful, and that's the convolutional feed-forward neural network. Convolutional feed-forward neural network has an architecture inspired by the visual hierarchy, where in the first layer, each unit sees just a little bit of the input image. So it has this restricted receptive field inspired by the primate visual hierarchy. And then in addition, the little template of connection weights through which it sees the little piece of the input that it's sensitive to is automatically replicated across all locations in the image, giving us a feature map, and that's a retinotopic representation, if you will, where the same little weight template is applied to all locations in the image, all over the image, and you get a map which you can think of as a map of where this little feature is present in the image. Computing these little weighted combinations amounts to convolving the image with this little weight template, and that's why these networks are called convolutional neural networks. In the first layer, they'll have not just one such feature map, but a number of such feature maps. You see that these feature templates here look a little bit like Gabors. They're not exactly Gabors. They're actually features that were learned by a deep neural network by gradient descent when the network was trained on a visual recognition task. So when you train networks for this very high level function of mapping from images to categories, what emerges in these early layers is the kinds of features that, at least qualitatively, I actually found in biology in the primate brain. So this would be a single convolutional layer. This is often followed by some kind of pooling operation, taking local maxes or averages, and by normalization very often. And this whole sequence is called a layer. And then these layers are stacked in deep hierarchies where you have perhaps 7 or perhaps 150 layers like that, which with each one feeding its output into the next one. And this is just one particularly successful early sort of circa 2012 architecture that works quite well and is in some broad sense inspired by the primate visual hierarchy. But there's an incredibly rich literature in engineering of different architectures using skipping connections and many different ways of combining these elements in networks that have been very successful in engineering applications, particularly in vision, but increasingly also in many other domains. So this is exciting because a technology that's originally inspired by the brain, if only at a very coarse scale and with some sort of naive optimism, perhaps, is vindicated by success in terms of our ability to model intelligent information processing. So the fact that these brain-inspired neural network models are now a dominant technology in AI is very important for us as we're trying to figure out how the human brain processes information, because it provides a technology for us, it provides software platforms for us to model human brain information processing at scale, in the sense that we can build models that actually perform the cognitive functions whose implementation in the brain we'd like to understand. And so this puts us in a different regime where we're dealing with these very big models, and big here means that they have millions of parameters. And this is something that's uncomfortable in a lot of ways, because these models are more difficult to build and more difficult to interpret also than the smaller models that we might be used to. However, from my perspective, we have to engage these models, because if we're going to explain how cognition is implemented in the brain, we need models that can actually perform significant feats of cognition, such as visual object recognition. And these feats, as we know from the history of AI, require complex models. They require models that have sufficient capacity to store the knowledge that is needed for feats of intelligence. So more concretely, in the context of vision, in order to recognize things, you have to know what stuff looks like, and that is not infinitely compressible, right? So we'll never have a model of vision that has a dozen parameters or something like that. It needs to have ample capacity to store visual information and to absorb statistical information about the visual world. On the other hand, we have big data increasingly. There's a revolution in methods in biology to measure brain activity data. And we also have very large amounts of world data now, such as images that we can access online. And we have large amounts of behavioral data. And through online experimental methods and harvesting information collected online inadvertently, we can gain access to much richer constraints from behavior also than we could perhaps a decade ago. So an important question is how we can connect theory and experiment. How can we use the big data that we now have access to in order to constrain and test these big models which implement the theories that we really want to adjudicate among? One thing to keep in mind when thinking about this grand challenge that I think no one knows the solution to at this point is the amount of constraint that we can get from these different sources. So we have very rich brain data, but arguably we have even richer behavioral data at our disposal. So brain data still are, even though we can, with functional imaging in humans, we can get to higher resolutions, and we can get perhaps 100,000 voxels in the human brain with high resolution, high field fMRI, and we can get down to single cell resolution in animals with functional imaging techniques such as calcium imaging. But still, these are very expensive data also, and it's very limited in terms of the numbers of animals that we can image. Behavioral data are comparably more available, and world data are even more available, right? So when we think about how to connect the data to the models, we have to keep in mind what kinds of data we have and how abundant these different sources of constraint for our models are. So I think this is an open problem. I'm putting up this slide to kind of pose this problem that I think we need much more ideas on. It's a sort of wide open creative challenge. But I also want to put this up in order to contextualize what my lab is working on, which is sort of first steps at drawing some connections there and trying to find our feet in this new reality, if you will. So we take a divergent and a convergent approach. The divergent aspect is that we're exploring the space of computational models. And this means exploring different neural network architectures, including aspects like skipping connections, recurrent connections, and stochasticity that go beyond the feed-forward convolutional framework that I just sketched out. And also different variations on the training, where we vary the stimuli and the tasks. We might use artificial stimuli or more controlled stimuli that we can generate alongside natural images and videos. And we also experiment with different objective functions, such as supervised and unsupervised, and different learning rules. And then we try to combine that with a convergent approach, where we're constraining the models with brain and behavioral data. So one level at which we can do this is by inferential model selection. So the model parameters in this case are learned for a task, and then we have these perfectly trained models, all of which can perform the task at a reasonable level. And then we want to do inference that helps us adjudicate between a discrete set of such models. we can also use the brain and behavioral data to directly fit the parameters of the models. For example, we might want to reweight the units of a layer in a neural network so as to use the brain data to determine the relative prevalences of a set of computational features that we are hypothesizing exists in a given brain region. A more flexible way of adapting a model would be to allow for linear remixing of units. So this is the approach known as encoding models, and that's a very powerful and flexible way of changing the parameters of a model, of linearly recombining all the units in a neural network model so as to best explain, for example, responses in single neurons or in voxels measured with fMRI in humans. And then finally, we can do deep learning of model parameters where we use the brain activity data directly to backpropagate deep into these neural networks and use the methods that we use for task training to directly constrain the network to be better at explaining brain activity data. And this is the most flexible approach. And it's also difficult because of the severe limitations on the amount of brain data that we have. So historically, this extreme level of flexibility has not been very successful, but as we get richer brain data and additional constraints from all these other sources of information, we should also keep an eye on that option for driving the models into alignment with the data. And all of this, of course, it's important to see that, as we funnel the information from these different sources of data into our models, we have to be aware of the issue of overfitting, and we have to look at generalization performance in order to test our models. So how can we test a neural network model with brain activity data? In my lab, we've been developing a particular approach that we call representational similarity analysis, in which we present a set of stimuli to the brains of our subjects and to our models. And then in a given area of cortex of each of our subjects, we have a pattern of activity associated with each of the stimuli, which we interpret as a representation in that cortical area of each of these stimuli. And in the models, similarly, in a given layer of the model, we have a pattern of activity across the units in that layer of a neural network model associated with each of the particular stimuli. And we think of these also as representations of the stimuli in the layers of the model. So the problem then becomes, how can we now look at this stimulus response matrix that we have for the brain region and the stimulus response matrix that we have for the model, and assess whether the model is a good model of the brain region. This is a difficult problem because our model might have tens of thousands of units, and in the brain region, we might have measured hundreds of neurons in a primate or hundreds of voxels in a human. We don't necessarily know the correspondency between the units of the model and the responses that we've measured in the brain. So one approach here, which is quite powerful, is to fit a linear mapping, and that's the approach of encoding models that I mentioned just before. And that's one powerful approach to this. However, it requires fitting a lot of parameters. For each measured response channel, we have to fit a weight for each of the units. So if those are tens of thousands of units, you might be fitting something like a million weights in total. So the approach that we usually take gets away with less fitting, or gives us the option of doing relatively less fitting. And this approach is based on looking at the relationships between these activity patterns within the measurements made in the same brain region in a given subject, and within the patterns recorded in a layer of a neural network model. So we compare each stimulus representation to each other stimulus representation, and this gives us a representational dissimilarity. And we interpret this as an indication of how much that regional representation cares about the distinction between these two stimuli. We can think of these patterns as points in a response space and the dissimilarities as the distances between these points. And so in this framework, we think of the geometry of the points in the multivariate response space that correspond to the stimuli as the signature of the representation. And so we want that signature to be well predicted by the model. And so we compare these representational dissimilarity matrices, which I indexed horizontally and vertically by the stimuli, where we can look up for each pair of stimuli how distinct they are in the representation, and then compare that level of distinctness between the representations, and do so for all pairs of stimuli to see if the overall pattern, the overall geometry of the representations matches. We have to couch this, so this is a useful framework for having a kind of descriptive comparison between the representational spaces of a model and a brain region. But we have to couch this in a statistical framework in order to actually do inference and adjudicate among models. So we do training and testing and cross-validation whenever we want to still fit parameters. So the way this works is we take each of these representational dissimilarity matrices and we designate a subset of the stimuli as training stimuli. And then we have one such matrix for each of our subjects, and we also designate a subset of our subjects as training subjects. And we use these training data shown in blue here to do any parameter fitting that we might want to do. And this could be, for example, a weighting of different feature maps in order to model, to account for the fact that we might not know how relatively prevalent different computational features are in the neural population. And then we have a separate set of test stimuli. And for these separate test stimuli, we consider responses in a separate set of test subjects, such that this is cleanly cross-validated with overfitting to neither the subjects nor the stimuli. And this enables us to get an unbiased estimate of each model's performance after fitting. So we're accounting for any bias that might be that might arise from the fact that we're fitting parameters of these models. And we're requiring not just to avoid the overfitting to the noise, but also the overfitting to the stimuli and the subjects. So each model is challenged to generalize across subjects and stimuli. So this gives us unbiased estimates of model performance, but it doesn't put us in a position to do statistical inference. So in order to be able to do frequentist statistical inference to compare these models, we wrap around this a bootstrapping of the stimuli and of the subjects. So this is a way of then getting confidence intervals on the performance differences between each pair of models, and in a way that treats both subject and stimulus as a random effect, with a view to generalizing to the respective populations of stimuli that our set of stimuli can be considered a random sample of, and to the population of people or animals within that species that are sample of subjects can be considered a random sample of. So when we do this, here I'm going to show you results from this approach to testing models. And I'm going to plot along the vertical the accuracy of the human inferior temporal dissimilarity matrix prediction. And as we go up the layers of a deep convolutional neural network, we do better and better at explaining variance in this human inferior temporal representational dissimilarity matrix. So these are the convolutional layers of this particular network called AlexNet, a famous early example of a deep convolutional feed-forward network. There's a little bit of a jump when we go to the fully connected layers. And then when we use a weighted combination of the layers together with SVM discriminants for prominent categories, then we have another little jump in terms of the explained variance here. We can compare these results to a noise ceiling, where the upper bound of the noise ceiling is the highest accuracy that any model can achieve. And that's based on the fact that what we're predicting here is the average correlation across subjects of the prediction of the representational dissimilarity matrix. And because every subject has a distinct representational dissimilarity matrix, no possible model can be perfectly correlated with all subjects on average, right? So there's some model predicted representational dissimilarity matrix that's sort of right in the cloud in between all the subjects that maximizes the average correlation, and that model would achieve this correlation. And when we use the average representational dissimilarity matrix of all subjects but one to predict one held out subject, and we do that in cross-validation, then we get this lower bound, what we call the lower bound of the noise ceiling. And this is an estimate that we expect to fall lower than the performance of the true model, if the true model were one of our models that we're testing. So we see that none of these models are really within the noise ceiling. So there's a bit of unexplained variance left to be explained. We can also do model comparisons here, and then we see that this best model here is significantly better than all the convolutional layers. And here for comparison is the performance of a wide range of computer vision features, hand-engineered features that we have been testing before deep neural networks started to seriously work for computer vision. So this kind of result that we can explain these high-level ventral stream representations with deep convolutional feed-forward networks has been seen in a number of different labs. Oh, here's another little wrinkle to this. We see when we look at different areas and early visual areas, we see the lower levels work well at explaining the representational geometry. And in these mid-level layers, we see these higher layers work better. And in Marcel van Gellen's lab, they used a data set from Kendrick K to map out the degree to which different layers in a deep feed-forward convolutional network could explain voxels in different regions of the human ventral stream. And they see this beautiful gradient where the higher layers better explain a higher level representations in human cortex. This has been done by our lab and also by other labs, not just in humans, but also in monkeys. So here's an example from Dan Yamin's work while he was still in Jim DiCarlo's lab with similar results. Here's the prediction of the responses to many different individual images of a deep convolutional feed-forward network where what's being predicted is the windowed spike count of a single neuron. So this really works very well and much better than any of the models that people had been using for a very long time, and in order to try to explain the response of IT neurons to novel images. That was always an impossible computational modeling challenge. And with deep convolutional feed-forward networks, that's now not solved. There's still unexplained variance, but it's a major advance. So the converging feed-forward story, from my perspective, is that deep convolutional feed-forward neural networks explain how the initial sweep through the primate visual hierarchy enables recognition at a glance. They predict representations of novel images better than any alternative current models. Both the architecture of the model and the task training contribute substantially to these successes. I haven't shown you this, but detailed studies on this in our lab and others suggest this. However, we need to build models whose architecture more closely resembles the visual hierarchy. And one major feature of biological neural networks is recurrent signal flow. So this is something that we're very interested in my lab to understand what the role is of recurrent signal flow and to what extent this role might go beyond some rather superficial functions of feedback, such as attention and modulation of responses, to what extent recurrence might implement a fundamentally different algorithm for recognition. So Courtney Spura in my lab, while we were still in Cambridge, UK, asked the question, do recurrent convolutional neural networks provide better models of vision? So he contrasted different architectures on a little toy task. And the first architecture was the classical architecture, the feed-forward FF-CNN convolutional neural network architecture, which in the context of this project, we called B for bottom-up. And then he finally, there's the full version, the BLT, bottom-up, lateral, and top-down recurrent convolutional neural network, where each unit now also sees a restricted receptive field in the layer above. And again, these little top-down weight templates for the connections are automatically generalized across spatial positions. So these kinds of networks still have very manageable numbers of parameters, because for each feature map, we just need to learn these three little weight templates, and it's not a huge number of parameters to be learned. So Courtney started by trying out these networks on little toy tasks. One of the toy tasks that we used, we call digit debris. This is recognition under occlusion. And here's the task. You see these little digits. So in this case, the target digit is a 3. In this case, it's a 1. You see the 3 here in the back. And here you see the 1. But in front of it is a lot of clutter. And the clutter is pieces of other digits. And the motivation for this task was to maximally confuse the kind of mechanism that a feed-forward convolutional network relies on, which is to recognize little pieces of the image, to represent little pieces of the image, and then compute weighted combinations of the evidence in order to figure out what class the image belongs to. And we see that in this kind of situation with light debris, we see that the classification error is lower for these recurrent neural networks than for different feed-forward neural networks, which have been matched in the number of parameters to the recurrent networks. And as we make the debris more serious, this effect becomes even more pronounced. And we see basically out of the box a quite clear advantage for the recurrent convolutional models over the feed-forward models in this task. Courtney also worked with another task, which we call digit clutter, where it was about recognizing multiple digits that include each other. So that looks like this. So in this case, you're supposed to say 235, and here you're supposed to say 354. You're supposed to recognize all of the digits that are there, and we could do this with 3 digits, 4 digits, or 5 digits. And again, we saw that the recurrent networks outperformed the feed-forward networks quite consistently and significantly. So that was encouraging, but these are just toy tasks, and ultimately an algorithm that is supposed to be a model for human recognition of images in the real world has to scale up to natural images. So in his next project, Courtney asked whether recurrent convolutional networks can be scaled up to process natural images. And he had a number of architectures, the feed-forward architecture to start with, which he rendered recurrent by adding these lateral connections with restricted receptive fields and weight sharing, so recurrent convolutional framework. And then a number of parameter matched feed-forward architectures, where he changed different aspects of the feed-forward architecture in order to approximately match the number of parameters. So he gave these feed-forward networks either broader features, you see here in light blue, or more feature maps in each layer, or twice the number of layers. And he adjusted the parameters of these architectural choices to approximately match the number of parameters. An interesting feature of these recurrent convolutional neural networks is that they can trade off speed of computation for accuracy. So here I'm going to show you the computational cost measured in floating point operations versus the accuracy of the model. And when we look at these feed-forward models, we find that the models that require more computation also had higher accuracy. So there's kind of a trade-off between the amount of computation at inference that is required to process a single image and spit out a label for that image, and the accuracy with which the model can perform the task, which was ImageNet in this case. And here's the recurrent convolutional network. So the recurrent convolutional network has the attractive property that we can run it for shorter or longer. And what we've done here is use an entropy threshold on the softmax output. So the softmax output we can think of as a probability distribution across the categories of output. So the values in this this essentially one hot output, there's a number of categories, and the activities add up to 1, and we can interpret them as a probability distribution across the outputs. And as the network processes, in the beginning, there's a broader distribution across categories, indicating that the network is not yet very certain about which category the image belongs to. And as the recurrent computation progresses, the probability mass in the output concentrates. And when it dips under some entropy threshold, then we terminate the computation. And when we do this at different entropy thresholds, then we get a mean computational cost at that entropy threshold, and we get a mean accuracy. And when we plot that function, it's very interesting. It was very interesting for us to see that it passes through these particular points marked by the feed-forward models, which are not flexible in terms of their computational cost. However, we can also run the recurrent convolutional network longer, and then it beats these 3 feed-forward models. So the interesting thing is that this recurrent convolutional model with the confidence threshold defined by the entropy predicts reaction times. So it can compute longer on harder images, and it can terminate faster for easier images. And also you can adjust the required confidence for termination, and then you can have lower accuracy at lower computational cost. So this enables us to predict human reaction times. So here we're comparing many different models to human categorization reaction times. And what we find is that these recurrent convolutional models do relatively best at predicting these image by image human reaction times in categorization. So there's still some ways off the noise ceiling. So clearly there's unexplained variance there, but nevertheless, it's encouraging to us that without really fitting these models extensively to human behavior, they perform better in this comparison. Tim Kietzman, who's now a PI at the Donders Center in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, asked the question whether recurrent neural network models can capture the representational dynamics of the human ventral stream. So he used an MEG data set from Radoslav Čihe, and he reanalyzed that data set using source reconstruction, where he used the individual MRI volumes from the individual subjects to reconstruct the cortex, and then use minimum norm estimates to disentangle the MEG signals into 3 regions of interest. So we could sort of disentangle these convolved MEG signals and get a separate multivariate response at each time point to each image for each of these 3 sort of stages of ventral stream processing. So this enabled us to estimate the RDM, the representational similarity matrix, as a movie, as a function of time, for each of these 3 regions for the different stages of the ventral stream. And I'm going to show you this movie now, 100 times slowed down. So here at the top, you see the RDMs in the beginning. So yellow is high dissimilarity, blue is low dissimilarity. At the moment, you see just noise. This is rank transformed. So you always see sort of the full distribution of the current values there. And at the moment, it's all noise because it's before stimulus onset. And then in the second and third row here, you see the MDS, the multidimensional scaling arrangement corresponding to that RDM at each time point. And here you see it with color coding for the different categories. And here you see the actual stimuli, which were little isolated object images. So when we look at this movie, we see a kind of staggered emergence of different categories that begin to cluster and separate from other categories in the representational geometry. And we see a qualitatively different picture in different stages of the ventral stream. So it's not just that the higher regions go through the same trajectory, but at a later point in time, but each region has its unique set of geometries and a very interesting dynamics. So just sort of looking at these kinds of data is very interesting to us, just descriptively, to give us a sense of the data. But it's also hard to interpret. So we need to bring some models to these data. So here what we've done is we've looked at the degree to which the representational geometry predicted by the GIST model, which is a popular model of low-level image features, correlates with the representational geometry at each point in time in each of these 3 regions. And we see that this low-level feature model explains the geometries quite well around, between maybe 50 and 120 milliseconds. And then it doesn't do so well anymore in these higher regions, V4, LO, and IT, but it continues to do somewhat well in the early visual cortex. And when we look at the degree to which animate objects are clustered in the representation, we see this really intriguing picture here where within the first 100 milliseconds, there's not as much happening. Then between 100 and 200 milliseconds, this clustering of animates becomes very pronounced in the highest region in IT. Then it almost completely breaks down while the stimulus continues to be on. We see the stimulus is on for 500 milliseconds here. And after 200 milliseconds, then this distinction between animates and inanimates seems to transfer back to the V4 LO cluster and become very pronounced there. So this is an example of a complex kind of observation that's not really easily accounted for with a feed-forward model of computation. To then more directly constrain computational models with these data, we used a technique to fit the model representational dynamics. And the technique is called deep representational distance learning, where we use these RDM movies directly to learn the parameters of the recurrent convolutional neural network model by deep learning. So this is gradient descent to drive the dynamics predicted by this recurrent convolutional model into alignment with the measured representational dynamics. We fit this model to the RDM movies, and then we test it with different images, importantly, because it's important to account for possible overfitting, not just to the noise, but also to the set of images being used. And when we did this in comparison to feed-forward control models, we see that these recurrent convolutional models better explain representations and their dynamics. And these are results of functional magnetic resonance imaging data that I haven't talked about. So the emergent recurrent story, as I see it at the moment, is that recurrent neural networks provide a more neurobiologically realistic and computationally powerful modeling framework. Recurrent processing can enable a network to recycle its limited computational resources over time to enhance its powers. These networks then perform more robust inferences, and they can flexibly trade off speed and accuracy, and they lend themselves to modeling human reaction time distributions. Recurrent models also better explain the representational dynamics of the human ventral stream. So in the last section of the talk, I am going to shift gears a little bit and talk about behavioral data on the one hand, and talk about experimental design on the other. And I'm going to tell you about a new method spearheaded in my lab by a brilliant postdoc, Tal Golan. And this method is called the method of controversial stimuli, where we pit different neural network models against each other as models of human recognition. So a little bit on the motivation for this. Theoretical progress depends on experiments for which competing theories make distinct predictions. We can implement these competing computational theories in testable neural network models. So that's one of the important functions of neural network models. They provide a language for us to express our theories so as to make our theories testable. However, neural network models have many parameters, and theoretically distinct models often make similar predictions for natural stimuli. So a first important insight is that to elicit models' distinct inductive biases, we can test models on a population of stimuli that we didn't use in training the models. And this is called out-of-distribution testing. And it's a very important direction in machine learning because it's important for evaluating to what extent machine learning models perform when they're exposed to a different distribution of stimuli. So it's equally important epistemically for cognitive computational neuroscientists to tell which of two different models is a better model of human brain information processing. So in order to get these out of distribution stimuli, we can use natural stimuli drawn from a different stimulus population, or we can use synthetic stimuli. For example, stimuli optimized using the models. So one approach there is super stimuli. If we can use computational techniques to make stimuli that are extremely exciting to a particular neural network model, then that constitutes a bold prediction about what should happen in the brains of human subjects when we present those same stimuli. So similar arguments can be made in favor of adversarial stimuli and metamares. The second insight is that since our goal is to adjudicate among models, we can create synthetic stimuli that are optimized to elicit distinct predictions from different models. So stimuli that are controversial among the models. So what we mean by controversial stimuli, a stimulus is controversial when two models disagree over it. In other words, the two models make distinct predictions, and that means that these controversial stimuli are powerful experimental stimuli for adjudicating among the models. So in superstimuli, we use computational techniques, for example, gradient descent, if the model is differentiable, to optimize the pixels of the image so as to drive a very strong response in a particular unit or a very strong average response in a layer of the model. So this has been explored in a number of studies shown here. We're very interested in this technique. We think that's great. But I'm putting it here in order to illustrate how it's different from what we're currently talking about, which is the controversial stimuli. In controversial stimuli, there's always at least two models, and we have some measure, some index of controversiality that measures how much the two models disagree at the level of the output classification or in terms of the internal representation. There seems to be a question here. Oh, it's not a question. Okay, we can talk about it later. So this is the basic idea of controversial stimuli. So we started doing this using a simple toy world of stimuli, the MNIST world of handwritten digits. And we wanted to have many different models to be tested. And we wanted these models to really correspond to conceptually different computational theories. So we had feed-forward models, we had recurrent models, we had generative models, so models that use generative models of the input distribution in order to do the inference. And we had adversarially trained neural network models. The controversiality index, which we optimized to make these controversial stimuli, was defined as follows. For each digit pair and each model pair, we have a controversiality index, which is computed from the image. And it's the minimum of these four values, where this term ensures that model A detects digit A and not digit B. These two terms ensure that at the same time, model B detects digit B and not digit A. So in other words, to make a controversial stimulus, we choose two models and we choose two digits, and then we optimize the image such that one model will say with high confidence that it's a 3, and the other will say with high confidence that it's a 7. and each model is going to be convinced that it's not the other digit. So we can think of this graphically by looking at 2 dimensions, where 1 dimension corresponds to model A. So on the left here is the case where model A detects a 3 but not a 7. And on the right, the case where model A detects a 7 but not a 3. So this is model A response. And then we have the model B response, where at the bottom, it's model B detecting a 3 but not a 7. And at the top, it's the opposite. So we have these green regions here where the models agree. And we have the red regions where the models disagree. When we look at natural handwritten digits, they all fall in these corners. So here you see the problem of using just natural stimuli, and in particular here stimuli from a distribution that the models have been trained on. All the models can recognize all these digits very well and in the same way as our subjects. So it's very difficult to distinguish the models in terms of how they classify the digits. In making these controversial stimuli, we start from a noise image, and then we drive the stimuli into these spaces where the models disagree. And we get these ambiguous stimuli like this one here that look maybe a little bit like 7 to some people and a little bit like nothing to people. But in this case, model A detects a 7 and not a 3, and model B detects a 3 and not a 7. So when we look at these controversial stimuli for these models, and there's actually an error on this slide. So here it says optimized by gradient descent. So we prefer to do the optimization by gradient descent, but that only works for differentiable models. So for some of these models, like the shot analysis by synthesis model, the one at the bottom here, they're actually not differentiable. So we're down to finite differencing and other methods to optimize these stimuli. But we have methods by which we can find controversial stimuli. So here's a particular set of stimuli for this pair of digits 3 and 7. So when we look at this one, for example, when PCN thinks it's a 3 and small VGG minus thinks it's a 7. And both of these models are very convinced that it's a 3 for one and a 7 for small VGG. So this is an example, and the same thing happens for all other pairwise comparisons between these first models here, these first 6 models in this comparison. So these are all what is known as adversarial examples. An adversarial example is a particular case of a controversial stimuli. It's of a controversial stimulus. It's a stimulus that is controversial between one model and the ground truth. So this is the case for all of these stimuli, and this provides evidence against both of the models in each case. So if the stimulus looks a lot like a 3 to 1 model and a lot like a 7 to the other model, but it doesn't look like anything to us, then that suggests that neither of these models is a good model of human perception. We look at this case here, CapsuleNet Recon sees a 7 and Madri L2 sees a 3, and to most of our subjects, this looked like a 7, so CapsuleNet Recon dominated here. And when we did the opposite and optimized the stimulus to look like a 3 to CapsuleNet Recon and like a 7 to Madri L2, then it looked like a 3 to us and our subjects. So again, CapsuleNet Recon dominated. And this was the case also for comparisons of CapsuleNet Recon to each of these other first 6 models. But then when we looked at the Gaussian kernel density estimator model, the Gaussian KDE model, it seemed to dominate the CapsuleNet Recon model. So in this case, when we pitted Gaussian KDE against CapsuleNet Recon, Gaussian KDE always won. And then the same happened again for shot ABS, where shot ABS dominated all of these other models in this sort of when we just eyeballed these controversial stimuli. So this is sort of a preview of the more formal results that I'm going to show you in a moment. But this gives you an idea of the overall story here, where these later models, lower in the list, perform better. So what is it about these models? So we can look at feed-forward versus recurrent processing, and we find that this distinction doesn't really seem to explain this difference. We can also look at how these models were trained. Some of them were trained on MNIST. Some of them were trained on MNIST plus non-digits, so that they could learn the distinction between natural digits and non-digits. And some of them were adversarially trained. But this doesn't really explain why the last 3 models dominate the first 6 models. And here's the distinction that seems to be more meaningful, which is the distinction between discriminative models and models that in some way integrate the idea of a generative model of the distribution of stimuli. These last 3 models all have generative models of the stimulus distribution, and that seems to explain why they do better here. So now we're going to look at the same basic result, which I've shown you only for 3 and 7, more generally for other digits. So here's CapsuleNet Recon versus Madri L3. Now we're just looking at 2 models, but all of the digits. And you can see here whether the things that you see are quite ambiguous, but if you see columns of the same digits and they match these labels of CapsuleNet Recon, that would indicate that your perception is more consistent with CapsuleNet Recon. And this was the case for our subjects in this case. When we pit CapsuleNet Recon versus Gaussian KDE, most of our subjects saw the digits as consistent with the labels assigned by Gaussian KDE. And when we pitted this one against the shot analysis by synthesis model, then most of our subjects' perception agreed with the classifications of the shot analysis by synthesis model. So this is particular pairs. We made these stimuli for all pairs of digits and all pairs of models. So this is quite a rich set of stimuli. And then we did a behavioral experiment where we presented these images, and then we had subjects indicate which of the digits they saw in the image. And their responses were probabilistic at these different levels, 0, 25, 50, 75, and 100%. And they didn't have to add up to 100%. So you were allowed to indicate that an image looks both like a 3 and an 8, for example. And this was consistent with the way that the models work. The models also had sigmoid outputs, not softmax outputs. So the models could also indicate that several digits were present in the image. We did this in 30 subjects via Prolific and chose a subset of all these stimuli that I just showed you for this experiment. So the result here is that the shot analysis by synthesis model, as you might have experienced just before, significantly outperformed all the other models. However, several of the other models were quite close to the shot analysis by synthesis model, and none of these models is really very close to the noise ceiling. So clearly, in a sense, all these models fail at explaining the detailed pattern of human responses to these controversial stimuli, which shows us that these controversial stimuli are a powerful way of rejecting models and making sure that our data are informative about which models are good models. Cal next scaled this up to natural images using the CIFAR 10 set of small images. And the story is very similar for these three models here. You get these rubbish images indicating that none of these models are good models of human perception. And then you start getting things that look a little bit like things. For example, here, these look a little bit like horses, and that's what the stimuli were optimized to look like to the Angstrom L infinity model. And these ones look a little bit like cats, again, consistent with the Angstrom L infinity model's classification. So the Angstrom model seems to dominate the first three models. And then the story is a little bit similar with these models as we go down the list, each dominating all the models above. So the best model in this case was the graph wall joint energy model, which is a hybrid generative and discriminative model, and that seemed to perform best here. So here's the formal results where they're somewhat similar to the results for MNIST, where this graph wall joint energy model significantly outperformed all the other models, but all the models were rejected in the sense that none of them fully explained the variability of the detailed human responses. Tal then scaled this up to ImageNet, where you have much bigger images. And here's an example of controversial stimuli for the two classes Weimaraner and Persian cat. This is for a different set of models, because at this bigger scale of ImageNet, now we cannot do this optimization anymore unless the models are differentiable. So we used only differentiable models here, these larger scale ImageNet models that can process detailed natural images. And what we see is that this L2 adversarially trained network here outperforms some of the other models. So when we look at these two models, Inception V3 and ResNet 50, where we get these intriguing looking rubbish images indicating that neither of the models is like human perception. And when we compare these two models to the L2 norm adversarially trained models, the adversarially trained models are clearly superior. However, when we pit the two adversarially trained models against each other, we get these monster-like looking images that combine some of the features of Persian cats and Weimaraner dogs. And so this indicates that these models also don't really explain human perception. So my overall conclusions are that we can adjudicate among task-performing DeepNet models by inferentially comparing their representations to brain representations. Recurrent convolutional vision models better predict human ventral stream representational dynamics and reaction times. Controversial stimuli enable us to elicit differences in the inductive biases of DeepNet models. And finally, human vision may rely on a computational mechanism that combines elements of discriminative and generative inference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nico. That was amazing. Really nice talk.